The last rays of sunlight painted the dusty main street of North Platte, Nebraska territory, when Samuel Ingram counted the meager coins in his pocket, $2 to his name, earned from a month of backbreaking work at the Henderson Ranch. His weathered face, barely 25 years old but aged by harsh prairie winds and harsher fortunes, hardened with determination. The auction at the town square wasn't meant for men of his station, but desperation drove him forward. He needed someone to help work his failing homestead, and the mail-order bride who'd been rejected sight unseen was his only chance. The year was 1867. The war had ended just 2 years prior, leaving the nation in the painful process of stitching itself back together. Samuel had managed to avoid the fighting, being too young when it started and too far west when the calls for men grew desperate. Instead, he'd staked his claim on a small plot of land outside North Platte, trying to carve out a living from the stubborn soil. Next up, a damaged bride. Sight unseen by her intended, return to sender, announced Barney Walsh, the freight agent who occasionally doubled as auctioneer when unusual cargo needed disposing of. Woman's got papers, can read and write, but her face ain't right. Scarred something terrible from a fire, so I hear. Starting bid at $5. Samuel stood at the back of the small crowd, mostly curious townsfolk rather than serious bidders. No one spoke up. $4. Walsh tried again, looking uncomfortable. Silence stretched across the gathering. $3. Samuel felt his heart hammering. He couldn't afford much, but he needed help on his land and winter was coming. $2. Walsh finally said, desperation creeping into his voice. Surely someone can offer $2. Train east leaves tomorrow. Can't send her back again. Samuel stepped forward before he could think better of it. $2, he called out, his voice rough from disuse. Walsh's eyebrows shot up, and he nodded quickly. Sold to Samuel Ingram for $2. A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. Some chuckled. Others looked at him with pity. Old Mrs. Henderson whispered loudly enough for all to hear. Poor fool's just bought himself a lifetime of looking at ruined goods. Samuel ignored them all, approaching Walsh with his coins. Where is she? Waiting room at the station, Walsh replied, pocketing the money. Name's Zara Daniels. Been there since the morning train. Hasn't said much. Samuel nodded once and headed toward the station, aware of the stairs boring into his back. His boots kicked up dust with each determined step, his mind racing ahead. What had he done? What would he say to this woman whose intended husband had rejected her, only for her to be auctioned off like cattle? The small waiting room at the North Platte station was dim, lit by a single oil lamp. At first, Samuel thought it empty until he noticed a figure seated in the corner, partially hidden by shadow. She wore a simple blue traveling dress, her face obscured by a dark veil that hung from her bonnet. He cleared his throat. Miss Daniels. She turned slightly but didn't rise or lift her veil. Yes, her voice was soft but clear, with an Eastern accent he couldn't quite place. Samuel removed his hat, suddenly aware of his dirty clothes and unshaven face. My name is Samuel Ingram. That is to say. He fumbled for words that wouldn't sound cruel. I've arranged for you to stay at my homestead. You've purchased me, you mean, she replied matter-of-factly. For how much? Samuel flinched at her directness. $2, he admitted. She gave a short, bitter laugh. I suppose I should be flattered. My first intended paid nothing at all to send me back. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. Miss Daniels, I don't aim to treat you like property. I need help with my land, cooking, keeping house, maybe tending crops. It's a small place, but it's honest work. If you're not satisfied after a month, I'll pay your way to wherever you want to go. She was silent for a long moment before standing. She was taller than he'd expected, nearly reaching his shoulder, and she moved with a dignified grace that seemed out of place in the shabby waiting room. "Very well, Mr. Ingram. I have little choice and your offer seems fair enough. Shall we go?" Samuel nodded, then realized she couldn't see it clearly through her veil. "Yes, my wagon's outside. It's about an hour's ride to my place." He reached for her small trunk, but she placed a gloved hand on his arm. "Before we leave, Mr. Ingram, you should see what you've purchased." Before he could protest, she lifted her veil. The right side of her face was unblemished smooth skin, a delicate cheekbone, an expressive green eye. But the left side told a violent story. A burned scar stretched from her temple down to her jaw, pulling at the corner of her eye and mouth. The skin was mottled red and white, puckered in places where it had healed poorly. Samuel kept his expression carefully neutral, meeting her challenging gaze directly. "Are you ready to leave, Miss Daniels?" A flash of surprise crossed her face, the good side more expressive than the scarred one before she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Ingram, I believe I am." The wagon ride was quiet, with only the creaking of wheels and the occasional snort from Samuel's old mare breaking the silence. Zara sat stiffly beside him, her veil back in place, her hands folded primly in her lap. "It's not much," Samuel finally said as they crested a small rise, revealing his homestead in the valley below. 10 acres cleared, another 15 that need work, the cabin's sound though small. In the fading light, his homestead looked particularly pitiful, a single-room log cabin with a sagging porch, a small barn that leaned slightly to one side, and fields that showed more weeds than crops. What had once been his dream now looked like a monument to his failure. "You work this alone?" Zara asked. "Yes, madam. Had a friend help build the cabin and barn 2 years back, but he moved on to Colorado." Samuel guided the wagon toward the cabin. "Like I said, it's not much." "No, it's not," she agreed, but there was no judgment in her tone. "But it's something. More than I had this morning." Samuel helped her down from the wagon, then carried her trunk inside. The cabin was clean but sparse, a cast iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few books, tools, and supplies. "You'll take the bed," Samuel said. "I'll sleep in the barn until I can build proper accommodations." "That's unnecessary," Zara replied, removing her bonnet but keeping her face partially turned from him. "I can make a pallet on the floor." "No, madam. My ma raised me better than that." He lit a lamp and moved toward the door. "There's stew in the pot. Not much, but it's hot. I'll see to the horse and bring in some more firewood." Outside, Samuel leaned against the wagon and took a deep breath. What had he done? Brought a strange woman to his failing farm, a woman so clearly out of place in this rough country. Her hands were soft, uncalloused, her speech educated, and those scars, what horrors had she survived? By the time he returned with an armload of wood, Zara had removed her traveling clothes and was wearing a simple cotton dress. She'd tied her dark hair back and was stirring the stew. "It needs salt," she commented without looking up. "Haven't had the money for much beyond necessities," Samuel admitted. "Salt is a necessity, Mr. Ingram." She finally turned to him, and he saw she'd arranged her hair to partially cover the scarred side of her face. A garden would help as well. Herbs, vegetables. "You have good soil here, despite appearances." Samuel set the wood by the stove. "How would you know about soil? My father was a professor of agricultural science at Cornell University before he died." She ladled stew into the single bowl he owned. "You should eat." "You first, I can wait." "We'll share then. I'm not particularly hungry." That night, after Samuel had retreated to the barn with a blanket, he lay awake on a pile of hay, staring at the ceiling. He'd bought a woman today. No matter how he tried to frame it differently, that was the truth. The shame of it burned in his chest, yet what choice had he had? Let her be sent back east in disgrace. Leave her to whatever fate awaited unwanted women, and what of her? What desperate circumstances had driven her to become a mail-order bride, traveling thousands of miles to marry a stranger? Morning came too quickly, the roosters from the neighboring farm announcing dawn with enthusiasm. Samuel washed at the pump, then hesitated before approaching his own cabin. It felt strange now, knowing someone waited inside. Zara was already up, wearing a simple work dress and apron. Her hair was neatly braided, arranged to cover as much of her scarred side as possible. She'd somehow transformed his meager breakfast supplies into something that actually smelled appetizing. "Good morning, Mr. Ingram," she said, setting a plate of cornbread on the table. "I hope you don't mind that I've taken inventory of your supplies." "Not at all." Samuel sat awkwardly at his own table, feeling like a visitor. "You have a good foundation here," she continued, pouring him coffee that was stronger and better than what he usually managed. "But you need organization and planning. Your seed storage is inadequate and your tools are rusting." Samuel blinked at her directness. "I wasn't expecting an assessment quite so soon." "Time is valuable, Mr. Ingram. We've wasted enough of it." She finally sat across from him, her good side facing him. "I understand our arrangement, but I'd like to propose a modification." "I'm listening." "Instead of treating me as a purchased helper, consider me a partner in this venture. I have knowledge that could improve this homestead. Agricultural techniques, crop rotation, preservation methods. What I lack in physical strength, I can provide in planning and management." Samuel studied her, noting the determination in her visible eye. "Why would you want to partner with a failing farmer you just met?" "Because I have nowhere else to go," she answered frankly. "And because I recognize potential when I see it. This land could produce, Mr. Ingram, not just subsistence farming but actual profit." Samuel almost laughed. "Profit? Miss Daniels, I'm barely keeping from starving." "Which is precisely why changes must be made." She pushed a piece of paper across the table, a detailed list of tasks, improvements, and supplies. "This is what we need to start." Samuel glanced over the list, his eyebrows rising. "This would take all my savings and then some." "Yes, it would. But the return would be tenfold by next harvest. And if it fails," Zara met his gaze steadily, "then we'll be no worse off than you are now." Something in her confidence kindled a spark in Samuel's chest, hope long dormant. "All right, Miss Daniels, we'll try it your way. Call me Zara, please. If we're to be partners, formalities seem unnecessary." "Then I'm Samuel." She nodded once, a hint of a smile visible on the unscarred side of her face. "Now, Samuel, let's discuss crop rotation." The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Following Zara's detailed plans, Samuel repaired fences, built proper storage for seeds and tools, and prepared fields that had lain fallow for too long. He rode into town with a list of supplies, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed him. "Heard you bought yourself that scarred bride," Tom Miller said as Samuel loaded sacks of specialized seed into his wagon. "Must be desperate for company out there." Samuel straightened, fixing the man with a cold stare. "Miss Daniels is my business partner, and I'd appreciate if you'd keep your comments to yourself." "Business partner?" Tom laughed. "That what they're calling it these days?" Samuel's fists clenched, but he forced himself to turn away. Fighting wouldn't help their situation, and he needed to get back to the farm. Zara was waiting with more tasks than daylight allowed. At the homestead, Zara had been just as busy. She turned a patch of ground near the cabin into the beginnings of a kitchen garden, cleared years of accumulated junk from the barn, and somehow managed to make the cabin feel more like a home. She'd hung simple curtains made from old flour sacks, arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table, and scrubbed every surface until it shone. But more importantly, she'd drawn up detailed plans for expanding their operation. Her father's scientific approach to agriculture, combined with his extensive library that she'd committed largely to memory, gave her insights that Samuel had never considered. "We need to diversify," she explained one evening as they sat at the table, poring over her meticulously drawn plans by lamplight. "Corn is your staple, but it depletes the soil of certain nutrients. Rotating with legumes will restore those nutrients naturally." Samuel nodded, impressed by her knowledge but still skeptical about their prospects. "Even if this works, it'll take time we may not have. The bank's been patient, but they won't wait forever." Zara's expression turned thoughtful. "How much do you owe?" "More than I like to think about. Took out a loan for equipment last year, then the drought hit. Couldn't make payments." She tapped her fingers on the table, a habit Samuel had noticed when she was deep in thought. "There might be another way. How much do you know about raising horses?" "Enough to get by." "Why?" "The Army is always in need of good mounts, especially with the Western expansion. If we could establish a small breeding operation alongside the crops, it could provide faster returns." Samuel leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "That would take even more money we don't have." "Not necessarily. There's a wild Mustang herd in the hills to the north, if you could capture and gentle a few mares." She let the thought hang in the air. "That's dangerous work." "Most worthwhile things are," she replied simply. The next morning, Samuel rode out before dawn, heading for the hills where wild horses had been spotted. It was risky. Mustang hunting required skills he wasn't sure he possessed, but Zara's confidence had infected him. 3 days later, he returned leading 2 mares, exhausted but triumphant. Zara met him at the property line, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "You did it," she said, her usual composure slipping to reveal genuine amazement. Samuel dismounted, his body aching from days of hard riding. "Nearly broke my neck doing it, but yes." For the first time since she'd arrived, Zara smiled fully, unconcerned about her scars. The expression transformed her face, and Samuel found himself staring longer than was polite. "This is just the beginning," she said, excitement making her voice warmer than he'd heard before. "With these mares and proper breeding, we could establish a reputation for quality stock." As summer progressed into early autumn, the homestead began to transform. The fields were properly planted according to Zara's rotation plan. The mares were settling in, and Samuel had even managed to trade labor for a young stallion from a neighboring ranch. More importantly, Zara had written letters to former colleagues of her father, securing promises of specialized seed for the following spring. Their partnership had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Samuel handled the physical labor, while Zara managed the planning, record-keeping, and garden. In the evenings, they would sit at the table and discuss the day's progress and future plans. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift between them. Samuel found himself looking forward to those evening conversations, not just for the practical discussion, but for the chance to simply be in Zara's company. She was revealing herself to be not just knowledgeable, but witty and insightful. For her part, Zara had stopped trying so hard to hide her scars around the homestead. She still covered up when they rode into town together, but at home, she'd begun to simply pull her hair back practically, letting Samuel see her fully. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "How did it happen? Your scars, I mean." He immediately regretted his bluntness. "I'm sorry, that was impertinent." Zara was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. I was 19. There was a fire in my father's laboratory. He'd been experimenting with chemical fertilizers. Her fingers traced the edge of her scarring absently. I managed to pull him out, but not before. She gestured to her face. And your father, he lived for another year, but the smoke damaged his lungs beyond repair. She turned to face him fully, letting him see both the scarred and unscarred sides of her face without concealment. After he died, I had nothing. No family, very little money, and prospects diminished by. She gestured to her face again. So you answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. She nodded. It seemed the most practical solution. I didn't expect. Her voice faltered. I didn't expect my intended to reject me sight unseen. His letter said he couldn't bear to be saddled with a disfigured wife. Samuel felt anger rising on her behalf. The man's a fool. Perhaps. But his rejection led me here, so perhaps it was fortunate after all. Her gaze met his, steady and unashamed. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, an acknowledgement of their unusual circumstances and the unexpected bond that had formed. Samuel cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. It's getting late. We should turn in. Zara nodded, rising gracefully. Good night, Samuel. Good night, Zara. That night, lying on his pallet in the barn, he had insisted on continuing this arrangement despite Zara's protestations. Samuel stared at the ceiling, his thoughts in turmoil. He was developing feelings for Zara that went beyond admiration for her mind or gratitude for her help. But their relationship had begun with him purchasing her like property. How could anything genuine grow from such a foundation? The following week brought their first test. A bank representative arrived unexpectedly, clipboard in hand and skepticism in his eyes. Mr. Ingram, the man said, not bothering to dismount, I'm here to discuss your outstanding loan. Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers. Mr. Thompson, wasn't expecting you until harvest time. Plans change. The bank is calling in certain high-risk loans early. Thompson finally climbed down, looking around with undisguised judgment. I don't see much improvement here that would justify extending your terms. Before Samuel could respond, Zara emerged from the cabin, her face unveiled, her posture regal despite her simple dress. Perhaps you're not looking correctly, Mr. Thompson, she said, extending her hand. Zara Daniels, Mr. Ingram's business partner. Thompson stared at her face for a moment before awkwardly shaking her hand. I wasn't aware Mr. Ingram had taken on a partner. A recent development, one that will prove most profitable for all concerned, including your bank. She gestured toward the fields. If you'd care to inspect our operations, I'd be happy to explain the innovations we've implemented. Thompson looked as though he'd rather do anything else. But Zara was already walking, her voice carrying on the breeze as she outlined their crop rotation system, soil enrichment techniques, and plans for horse breeding. Samuel followed, watching in amazement as Zara systematically dismantled every objection Thompson raised. She cited agricultural journals, quoted profit projections, and eventually pulled out the meticulous records she'd been keeping. As you can see, Mr. Thompson, our projected yield for next season will more than cover the outstanding balance with interest. What we're proposing is a restructuring of the payment schedule to align with these projections. Thompson looked dazed by the barrage of information and Zara's unwavering confidence. I'll need to discuss this with the bank president. Of course, we've prepared this summary for his review. Zara handed him several neatly written pages. We look forward to continuing our mutually beneficial relationship with First Bank of North Platte. After Thompson left, Samuel turned to Zara in disbelief. That was. I don't even know what that was. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. That, Samuel, was business. Men like Thompson understand numbers and confidence. We provided both. You really believe all those projections you showed him? Every word. We're doing everything right, Samuel. This land has potential, and now we're finally tapping into it. She placed her hand lightly on his arm. You just needed to see it through different eyes. As autumn deepened, their hard work began showing results. The first experimental plots yielded better than expected, and 2 of the mares were confirmed in foal. More significantly, the bank had agreed to restructure Samuel's loan based on Zara's detailed proposals. The town's attitude was changing too. What had begun as mockery of Scarface Zara and $2 Sam gradually shifted as their operation gained credibility. When Zara's special seeds produced vegetables larger and more flavorful than the region typically saw, several neighboring farms began asking for advice. Samuel built a proper second room onto the cabin, insisting that Zara deserved her privacy. He moved back into the main room, finally abandoning the barn sleeping arrangement that had been increasingly unnecessary as mutual respect grew between them. One crisp October evening, they sat by the fire after a long day of harvest preparations. Zara was mending one of Samuel's shirts while he whittled a piece of wood, a skill he'd recently taken up during quiet evenings. "What are you making?" Zara asked. Glancing up from her stitching, Samuel turned the small carving in his hands. "It's supposed to be a horse. Not very good at this yet." "May I see?" She set aside her sewing and reached out. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the carving, and Samuel felt that now familiar flutter in his chest. Over the past months, these small touches had become more frequent, each one sending a current of awareness through him. Zara examined the carving, turning it in her slender fingers. "It's quite good, actually. You have an eye for detail." "I've been thinking," Samuel said, watching her hands rather than meeting her eyes. "About our arrangement." Her fingers stilled. "Oh, it's been nearly 6 months. I promised you could leave after a month if you weren't satisfied." He forced himself to look up. "Are you satisfied, I mean?" Zara set the carving down carefully. "Are you asking if I want to leave, Samuel?" "I'm asking what you want. This partnership has benefited me enormously. But I wonder if you've gotten what you need from it." She was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting shifting shadows across her face. "When I came here, I had nothing but the clothes in my trunk and knowledge that seemed useless in this new world. You offered me a purpose, a place to apply that knowledge. For $2, Samuel said bitterly. I've never forgiven myself for that. The $2 weren't for me, Samuel. They were for the opportunity to begin again." She leaned forward slightly. "But you still haven't answered my question. Do you want me to leave?" Samuel set down his whittling knife. "No," he said simply. "I don't." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. "Then I'll stay," she replied, "as your partner." Samuel nodded, both relieved and somehow disappointed. "As my partner." Winter arrived with unusual ferocity that year. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and howling winds made even short trips to the barn treacherous. Samuel and Zara found themselves confined together for days at a stretch. Their world narrowed to the warmth of the cabin and each other's company. They passed the time planning for spring, playing chess with pieces Samuel carved, and reading aloud from Zara's small collection of books. The forced proximity could have been uncomfortable, but instead it felt natural, as if they'd been sharing a home for years rather than months. On a particularly bitter night, as a blizzard raged outside, Samuel stoked the fire while Zara made tea. "You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Buying a bride, I mean." Samuel turned to her, surprised by the question. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary. I regret that you were treated like property. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I could never regret meeting you, Zara. She handed him a cup of tea, her fingers lingering against his for a moment longer than necessary. My father used to say that sometimes the most valuable discoveries come from the most unlikely experiments. Was he talking about his agricultural research? Yes, but I think it applies to people too. She sat beside him on the bench near the fire, closer than she usually would. Sometimes we find value where we least expect it. Samuel set his tea aside, gathering his courage. Zara, I need to say something. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. She looked up at him, her expression open, expectant. Yes, our partnership has been the best thing that's ever happened to this farm, to me, but I've been wondering lately if... He faltered, then pressed on. If there might be more between us than a business arrangement. Zara's breath caught audibly. What are you asking, Samuel? I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife. Not because I bought you or because it's practical, but because I've fallen in love with you. The words rushed out now, unstoppable. Your mind, your strength, your grace, the way you never let your scars define you, everything about you, Zara. Tears welled in her eyes, making both the scarred and unscarred sides glisten in the firelight. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Samuel? He shook his head, afraid to speak. I see a man who looked at a scarred woman and saw potential instead of damage, who offered partnership when he could have demanded servitude. She reached up, touching his face gently. A man who made me feel whole again when the world had decided I was broken. Is that a yes? He whispered. Yes, Samuel Ingram, I will be your wife. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. They were married the following week in North Platte's small church, with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. The town had gradually warmed to them, particularly after their farming innovations had proven successful enough that others wanted to adopt them. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. Their first foal was born a strong colt that Samuel named Pioneer. The specialized crops Zara had planned began to emerge from the soil with promise. And they learned that Zara was expecting a child of her own, due to arrive with the autumn harvest. Word of their agricultural success spread beyond North Platte. Farmers from neighboring counties began to visit, seeking advice on crop rotation and soil management. Samuel found himself hosting impromptu workshops, with Zara providing the scientific explanations while he demonstrated the practical applications. You should charge for this knowledge, said Frank Wilson, a substantial landowner from 20 miles away. What you're doing here could transform farming in this region. Samuel looked to Zara, seeing the spark of an idea in her eyes. That conversation led to their next venture, a small agricultural consulting business, with Zara writing detailed guides on improved farming techniques and Samuel providing hands-on demonstrations. They began by charging modest fees for their expertise, but as demand grew, so did their rates. By the time their son, William, was born in September 1868, the Ingram farm had become a local landmark. The Army had purchased their first 4 horses at premium prices, establishing their reputation as quality breeders. Their experimental crops had yielded harvests far exceeding regional averages. And their consulting business had a waiting list of farmers eager for their services. Not bad for a $2 investment, Samuel joked as they sat on their new, wider porch, watching the sunset while Zara nursed their infant son. She smiled, the expression now completely unselfconscious despite her scars. I think we've both proven to be sound investments. 3 years later, their homestead had transformed completely. The original cabin remained, but was now attached to a proper 2-story house with glass windows and a real kitchen. The barn had been rebuilt and expanded to accommodate their growing horse breeding operation. And most significantly, they'd purchased the adjoining 100 acres, expanding their experimental farming plots. When the railroad decided to establish a regional hub in North Platte, opportunity knocked again. Samuel and Zara were quick to recognize the potential in supplying food for the constant stream of workers and travelers. They established the region's first commercial produce operation, growing vegetables in quantities that could supply not just local needs, but allow for shipping to more distant markets. "You've got the touch, Ingram," the railroad superintendent told him after touring their operation. "Never seen crops like these in this part of the country." "It's science, not magic," Samuel replied, the phrase now a familiar refrain he'd learned from Zara. "And most of the credit goes to my wife." By 1875, the Ingram Agricultural Company was formally incorporated, with offices in North Platte and Omaha. They published farming almanacs, sold specialized seeds developed under Zara's direction, and consulted on large-scale agricultural projects throughout the territory. Their horse breeding operation had expanded as well, with Ingram bred stock commanding premium prices from the army and wealthy private buyers alike. Their family had grown too. William, now 7, had been joined by a sister, Elizabeth, and another brother, James. Their home was filled with books, scientific instruments, and the constant activity of a thriving family business. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Samuel had paid $2 for a scarred bride no one else wanted. They hosted a grand party at their estate, for it truly was an estate now, with the main house, outbuildings, and hundreds of acres of meticulously managed land. As twilight fell, Samuel found Zara standing alone on the balcony, looking out over their property. The years had been kind to her. At 35, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had overcome adversity and found her true calling. The scars remained, of course, but they seemed less prominent somehow, or perhaps it was simply that neither of them noticed them anymore. "Penny for your thoughts," Samuel said, joining her at the railing. "Inflation's made them worth at least a nickel by now," she teased, leaning against him as he wrapped an arm around her waist. "Worth every cent." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about out here all alone?" "Not alone. Never alone anymore." She turned in his arms to face him. "I was thinking about that day at the train station, how terrified I was to lift my veil, how sure I was that you'd recoil like everyone else had. But I didn't." "No, you didn't. You looked me in the eye and asked if I was ready to leave." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that 10 years of sun and laughter had etched there. "That was the moment, Samuel. The moment I thought perhaps I'd found something rare. And have you found something rare?" "I've found everything." She gestured toward the party inside, where their children were playing, their friends and employees were celebrating, and the evidence of their success surrounded them. Who would have thought that a scarred woman and a poor cowboy could build all this? "I seem to recall someone telling me this land had potential," Samuel said, pulling her closer. "Someone who saw possibility where others saw only failure." "We saw it in each other," Zara replied. "That's the real secret to our success." Inside, someone began playing a fiddle, and the sounds of dancing and laughter spilled out onto the balcony. "Mrs. Ingram," Samuel said formally, stepping back and offering his hand with a bow. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Zara curtsied, a playful smile on her face. "With pleasure, Mr. Ingram." As they danced beneath the stars, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them here, From $2 and desperation to becoming the richest family in the county. From a loveless arrangement to a partnership filled with deep, abiding love. From outcasts to community leaders. What are you smiling about? Zara asked, noticing his expression. Just thinking that I'm the richest man alive, he replied, and it has very little to do with money. Oh, and what does it have to do with? Finding someone who sees the best in me. Who pushes me to be better than I thought possible. He twirled her gently, then pulled her back into his arms. Someone who turned $2 into a fortune, but more importantly, turned a house into a home. Zara reached up to touch his face, her eyes shining in the moonlight. We built this together, Samuel, every bit of it. And we'll keep building, he promised. For the children, for ourselves, for the future. As the party continued around them, and their land stretched out in all directions, fertile, productive, and full of promise, Samuel and Zara Ingram stood together, testament to the power of seeing value where others saw only flaws, of finding strength in partnership, and of love that transforms everything it touches. From $2 to a fortune, from strangers to soulmates, from scarred and poor to whole and rich in all the ways that truly mattered.